Hello, and welcome to another edition of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam, and I've been living with multiple sclerosis for over 37 years. If you've been following my videos, I think I've shared kind of my history with multiple sclerosis, that in the beginning, I wasn't even really diagnosed officially for the first, 5-6 years after my initial symptoms. And then it was another bunch of years before I was even put on any kind of a DMT, a disease-modifying therapy. I was on Copaxone then for 10 years, roughly. And then I went off of it largely, probably almost entirely, because once I was classified as secondary progressive, no longer relapsing remitting, the insurance company decided that, there are no studies that prove that Copaxone helps with secondary progressive, so we aren't going to cover it anymore. And I think we all know the price tag on MS drugs is absurdly high, so I just discontinued it, though my doctor was kind of unhappy about that and tried to talk me out of it. And I suppose if I'd really needed it, I could have gone to the company that makes Copaxone and asked if I could get some kind of financial assistance. And by the way, that is always a good thing to do, because almost all the pharmaceutical companies do have some kind of hardship financial aid if you find yourself in that situation. I'd be curious to know if you have had any experience with talking with the pharmaceutical companies about that kind of thing. Well, anyway, I went off of it because I was not ever really in dire straits with my MS. I had some dizziness, balance problems, recurring optic neuritis, some other relatively minor symptoms, so I didn't really know whether the Copaxone was doing any good or not anyway, and I just went off of it. And ever since then, I have not been on any DMTs. And it's probably been a good, well over 10 years since I've been off of any kind of DMT. I've taken a few things for symptom management, but nothing like the DMTs that they have today. I would probably have done a different course of things if I had been diagnosed in more recent times. But be that as it may, that's just kind of how it is. So imagine my surprise to discover that there's been a study going on for quite a number of years now, looking at whether at a certain age, people with multiple sclerosis can discontinue their disease-modifying therapy, and whether that is, in the long run, okay or harmful. I looked up a few different resources that I'll just share with you today. I think it's kind of interesting that they would do a study like this, because can you think of another disease for which the medications that are prescribed might not be useful to you anymore? If you're on a high blood pressure medication, is there a point at which, you don't need to be taking that anymore because it's not going to do any good for you? Or a cholesterol lowering drug, or insulin for diabetes. I mean, you hear about other methods people use to reduce their blood pressure or to be able to get off insulin. But it's not usually just because you've reached a certain age or a point in life. And let's take a look at some of the resources that I found on the internet. I found this blog post on the website for the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI, from March of 2017. Can some MS patients safely stop taking medicines? So as you can see, it's been quite a while now since this was first looked at. And let's take a look at just a little bit of what they had to say here. So as we scroll down through this, it says that a PCORI-funded study is now testing whether some patients, after years of successful treatment, could safely stop taking those drugs. This is really looking at people who were on disease-modifying therapy for some period of time, and the therapy did seem to be helping. It reduced relapses. Maybe it kept the EDSS score lower, that their disability was not increasing. But then people decided, for whatever reason, to stop taking the drugs. The study's looking at what the effects would be of making that decision. And as they say here, why is this an important issue? The average annual wholesale cost of the drugs is $90,000. Now, this was in 2017. I think it may be way more than that now, especially for some of the newer drugs that weren't even available in 2017. Some of the treatments are taken orally, but others require injections. Most have side effects, some of which can be serious. And so there's a quote from a patient that says, I give myself a shot 3 times a week, and I don't want to do that for the rest of my life. So that's the question. Is it really going to make that big of a difference whether you stay on your medication or whether you choose not to? And the target population for these studies is people age 55 and older. And as we read here, as patients age, relapses generally happen less often, and there's a reduction in new lesions, Corboy says. And John Corboy is one of the lead doctors on this initiative, on this study. We'll hear from him a little bit in a moment. Most importantly, studies have shown that as people age, the medicines tend to be less effective. It's possible, Corboy says, that the Beland, who is 55, and that was the man that said he didn't really want to give himself a shot for the rest of his life, and others are getting little or no benefit from their medications while still experiencing side effects. And then they go on to talk about the risks of stopping medication. There is a risk to that. If you're on a DMT, you don't know whether the reason you're not having any relapses or you're not getting any worse is because you're on a medication, or if that would have been the case anyway. Scrolling a little further, it says that if the research finds no downside to stopping medication, Corboy thinks a larger study should take place, perhaps homing in on the best age to stop taking the medications. If, however, going off disease-modifying drugs carries significant risks, that would reassure physicians and patients that it's worthwhile to continue to use these medications in spite of the costs and hassle and side effects. And it says here, though, that there could be a gray area in the results where patients face a slight risk of relapse or lesion if they stop treatments, so that each patient and doctor would then need to weigh the options together. And I would say that that's a good general caution. If you're on a DMT and you're thinking that, gee, maybe I should stop, well, I would definitely talk to your doctor about that. They have an opinion, and you may choose to go with it or not, but it's always good to know their reasoning. They have seen your MRI scans, and they have followed you for some period of time. They have at least some insight as to whether or not the DMT that you're on is actually helping. But as Dr. Corboy says, ultimately, patient satisfaction is the bottom line. And I have to say that that is important, because if you're not happy with your DMT, and especially if it's costing you more than you feel you can afford, or if it's a hassle staying in compliance with taking the medication, I know injectables are particularly challenging that way. You're not satisfied and your quality of life is affected. That's really an important criterion. And it may be actually the one that matters almost more than any of the other ones. And I'm glad to see that the researcher of this study is in total agreement with that idea. Now, the blog that we just looked at was the one that introduced the original study, which has been completed, but the clinical trial that is currently enrolling people is the kind of the follow-up study on this same subject, but just still following up with a subset of the original cohort. and it's called Discontinuation of Disease-Modifying Therapies in Multiple Sclerosis, Extension of the DISCOMS Study. And you can see here, as we scroll down, it's being sponsored out of the University of Colorado in Denver, and one of the collaborators is the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. And here's the hypothesis. This is an important one. The main hypothesis of this extension trial is that among those who have successfully discontinued their DMT as part of the DISCOMS trial, in other words, did not have a new MS relapse or brain MRI lesion, and remain off DMT after DISCOMS, are at no greater risk of new or worsened MS disease activity compared to those who successfully continued their DMT as part of DISCOMS and remain on DMT, each assessed at least 1 year after termination of the primary DISCOMS study. So all that by way of saying they're going to be looking at the people who stayed on their DMT versus those who decided to go off their DMT and find out whether their health outcomes were any worse. And as you see, it's an observational study, which means there's no interventions. There's no medicines to take or actions to do other than, am I going to be on my DMT or am I not? And the two cohorts are the people who discontinue their DMTs versus those who continue on with their DMTs. As we scroll through, we see that most of these are patient-reported outcomes. As we saw in the PCORI literature to begin with in the original blog post, it's the patient that's important, the patient-reported outcome that matters. And then this goes through the eligibility criteria, and I won't go through that in detail because I think for the vast majority of people looking at this, they're going to find that they're not eligible just because they weren't involved in the original study. But given that this is a continuation, it's still looking at trying to refine whether or not a person could go off their DMT when they get older. But I just thought I'd give you an idea of the locations that are recruiting actively or will be. So Colorado, New York, Ohio is not yet recruiting but will be. Pennsylvania has one site that is recruiting and one that will be. Tennessee will be recruiting. Virginia is currently recruiting. So it's a big study and quite important. I think they're trying to enroll 100 people. So that's just to let you know that this is being looked at and actively right now being looked at. So now I have a clip from a video from Dr. John Corboy talking about these tests and kind of putting them in the context of the whole world and the tests they're doing.
So into this void, we step in with some randomized controlled trials, and there are 3 that are presently underway, ours in the U.S., Anne Kerbrot's in France, and Eva Stribes in the Netherlands, looking at different populations of individuals who are going to be in randomized controlled trials, discontinuation versus continuation of therapy. Ours is here. We had last patient, last visit a couple of weeks ago, 55 and older, all phenotypes of MS, no relapse for 5 years, no scan change for 3 years, and similar types of stability in these other populations. But in France, 50 plus with secondary progressive MS. In the Netherlands with Eva, 18 plus, a younger age population. They can be 18 to any age older, but all relapsing MS patients with no relapse for 5 years and no significant scan change for 5 years. And all 3 of these studies, looking at different populations, patients will give us a much better idea, I think, of what the likelihood is of recurrence of disease activity, looking at relapses, EDSS, cognitive stuff, as well as looking at NFL and other biomarkers in the later studies. Our study, unfortunately, will not include NFL because when we started the study, that was not commercially available. So we're hopeful that these randomized controlled trials will add substantially to the literature so we can have a better understanding of whether or not discontinuation is reasonable in different populations, and especially in our case, in 55 plus age. So hopefully this data will let us know what's going on with regard to potential discontinuation. Our data will be available before February 1st, probably in the middle of January. I hope to report that very soon in early 2022. In conclusion, then, the impact of initiation of DMTs in older MS patients is still mostly unknown. Even treatment in general for individuals who don't have late onset is really mostly unknown. Similarly, whether and when patients may consider discontinuation of presently available DMTs is unclear, and there's no concrete algorithm like individuals over a certain age with this many years since last relapse and this many years since last gadolinium-enhancing lesion. We don't have an algorithm like that, but we'd like to get one. The same issues are likely relevant, though, to starting, continuing, and discontinuing disease-modifying therapies, and those who are most likely to benefit are younger with shorter disease duration. They have a relapsing phenotype more likely than progressive. They have a lower EDSS compared to higher, and they more likely have had a recent relapse and gadolinium-enhancing lesions if you're going to either benefit or, on the other end of the equation, you're going to consider going off. Your risk is going to be higher if you've had a recent relapse or gadolinium-enhancing lesion. But discontinuing a medication is not the same as not using it, and so the 3 randomized controlled trials will give us unique information about what happens when you actually go off a medication, and especially with the concern that we might see, for example, higher relapse or rebound rates with those with fingolimod or natalizumab. We'll really want to make sure that we, over time, either with these studies or with other studies, try to get the best handle on what the factors are that are associated with risk of new disease activity in those patients.
Well, and this site was interesting to me because the only DMT I've ever been on was Copaxone, and that's been some time now. The Drugscom site has an article, What Happens If an MS Patient Stops Taking Copaxone? And here's the official answer. More trials are needed investigating the impact of discontinuing Copaxone treatment. In patients older than 60 years, that would be me, discontinuing Copaxone does not appear to make any difference to relapse rates, physical disability, or depression. Thirdly, the impact of discontinuing treatment in younger patients is uncertain. In younger people, the disease is more inflammatory, and treatment is likely to have more of an impact. And this is a theme that we've seen before, that in younger people, the disease has a more inflammatory course. And when you go in for your MRI, you see a lot more lit up spots, right? With the gadolinium contrast, you see a lot of spots where there's active inflammation. But the longer you have MS, the less inflammatory the disease tends to be. It tends to retreat kind of more into the smoldering MS that Dr. Giovannoni talks about. And there might still be progression and disability increase, but it's not necessarily going to show up on the MRI the way it does when you're younger. And then fourthly, observational studies report that patients with MS who persist in using injectable disease-modifying treatments and adhere to the prescribed timing, dosing, and frequency of medication administration have a lower risk of relapse and a better self-reported quality of life than patients who discontinue or are non-adherent. And it sounds like what they're saying here is that those who stay on the DMTs are reporting that they're having a lower risk of relapse, that as opposed to actual relapse, but a lower risk of relapse. And those who stay on their DMT are reporting a better quality of life than those who discontinue or who don't really adhere to it. In other words, if you're supposed to take your medicine every day and you aren't very diligent about doing that, that would be non-adherent. And then finally, a study is underway which is scheduled to wind up in 2021, which may better answer the question. And of course, that's the study we've been talking about, which is almost done. I think that The first section of the study was done, and now they're working on that extension so that they can better clarify the answers that they got from the first study. And scrolling just a little further here, it says that one study looked at the effects of discontinuing treatment in people who were either on Copaxone or interferon beta 1A. There was no difference in the following outcomes compared to people who remained on treatment: time to clinical relapse, number of new lesions or inflammatory lesions on MRI, or progression of physical disability inflammatory events. So that tells you that, at least in the case of Copaxone and interferon beta, there doesn't seem to be a difference in those particular outcomes. Those clinical outcomes seem to be unchanged whether you stay on your medicine or not. It says another study reported that Copaxone reported the fewest discontinuations based on safety concerns, and it is generally well tolerated. And people did report that the frequency of Copaxone injections meant it was associated with a higher burden than some other medications for MS, and I will attest to that. I was actually very adherent to it. The doctor was quite surprised and impressed that I was on my meds on probably most weeks 7 out of 7 days, and except for a few times when I had to be on travel and it was just too difficult to keep the medicine cool, I was actually on it almost 100% of the time. And he told me that most of his patients on Copaxone were lucky to do the injections 3 or 4 times a week, not every day. It was just too burdensome to do that every day. And as we know, the Copaxone shots nowadays are formulated so that you don't have to give them every day like they did when I was taking it. And here's another interesting thing. In 2018, there was a study that evaluated 600 patients with MS who were older than 60, and it found no significant differences in disease outcome between those who stopped therapy compared to those who continued with treatment. There were also no difference in outcomes such as walking speed, hand function, or depression. And this is important, this next part. It's uncertain the effect that treatment discontinuation has on younger people with MS, because in younger people, the disease is overwhelmingly inflammatory, which tends to die down as people get older. Treatment discontinuation in these people may negatively affect patients' clinical outcomes. And that is very much in keeping with what we just saw in the other articles and video that we looked at. Well, it was interesting for me to look at all of that and to realize that inadvertently, I actually more or less could have been part of that clinical trial, because that's exactly what's been going on with me. And it does seem that if you fall into that category where you're over 55 and your MRIs do not show any new lesions, and you don't seem to be having any relapses, your disability does not seem to be increasing. In other words, if you've been stable for at least 3 years, it's quite possible that you could stop taking your disease-modifying therapy at this point, and it wouldn't do you any harm. But I think as I said earlier, it would really be a good idea to talk seriously with your doctor about that, because there is always the chance that it's doing you some good whether you know it or not. And as we've talked a lot about the idea that smoldering MS is always going on, whether it shows up on the MRI or not, that's another thing to really take into consideration, and not just think about convenience or saving some money. It might very well be that those medicines are doing you more good than you even know. But it's all very individual, and I'd love to know if you've dealt with this same issue and what side of it you've come down on. Leave me a comment and let me know.